to the audience and say, "My fellow Americans," and then sit down quickly, your job is done. Which is exactly what I did. Let me turn the program over to Karna. Welcome to Spring Island.
He spoke longer than that, and he was terrific. He was great. I love it. Thank you, Michael. You know, when it comes to doing an introduction, I guess a little inflation is okay once in a while. You know, I get this call from Michael, and he said, you know, Karna, you and Dick really have to come to Spring Island, and it is a beautiful place. Chris showed me around this afternoon, and oh, it's gorgeous. I'm glad to be here. But he said, you know, I was thinking about things. You do believe in free enterprise, right? You know that, Michael. I worked for Reagan. Well, and I know, and you know, you always said you believe in a free press, correct? And I said, well, yeah, I did work there too. Well, then it follows you believe in free speech, so come to my club and give one. I said, yeah. We can do that. Okay. So I thought what would be fun to do with y'all today is to try to answer a question that authors always get. And that is, where do you get your ideas? Well, any one of you could open the morning newspaper or turn on the news or check online and see a veritable petri dish of plot points, right? Crises all over the world, attacks here and there, planes crashing, political intrigue. Lord knows it could be turned into a pretty good mystery and thriller when you think about it. But I figured out that being there is even better. So I thought back to many of the events and experiences that I had when I had the honor of working in the White House for those 6 years. And I thought, I know what I'll do. We'll take a little bit of a trip down memory lane and remind you of some of those events and show how you could turn, if not the specific event itself, the settings. All my books have scenes in the Situation Room where we had meetings every day, in the Oval Office, the Roosevelt Room, the State Dining Room, the West Wing, you know, the mess where we always had lunch, and also the characters. And yeah, you could create some pretty good stories, right? So let's begin with the very first event that's absolutely seared in my memory, and I'll bet in many of yours too. Well, not some of you young people. This is a history lesson. But anyway, for maybe the rest of us. It happened about 9 weeks after the inauguration of President Reagan. The date was March 30th. I was scheduled, on the official schedule, to be in the staff car with Press Secretary Jim Brady to go to an event on March 30th. Well, I remember standing in front of his desk there in the West Wing press office and yeah, complaining a little bit. Oh, God, I got all these press calls to return, and I got to do some research for your next briefing, and all this sort of thing. And Jim looked at me and said, hey, no big deal. Look, you don't really have to go. I can handle it myself. You go tomorrow, handle the press tomorrow. This is a little speech at the Hilton Hotel for a union group. What the heck? I'll see you about 2:30. I said, okay, fine. As everybody knows. When he walked out with the president, Jerry Power, members of the senior staff, I probably would have been standing right next to him. When John Hinckley fired 6 shots in 3 seconds using 2 hands combat style and what he called a devastation bullet that he thought would explode inside the victim. It didn't explode for one reason: he was using a smaller gun, a .22. Now, what happened to the bullet? The one that hit the president, not the others. We figured this out, analyzing film and whatnot later. It was a ricochet deal. That bullet first hit the car, and it kind of skittered along the edge of the car, and it flattened out a little bit in that trajectory. And when it hit the president, it kind of went in more like a, you know, a slit, kind of like a thin dime, and the wound closed up. Okay, they throw him in the car, they dash off to the hospital, skid up there to the curb, and always cognizant of his position as president, very respectful of the office. Reagan gets out of the car and attempts to button his coat, shot, and when he got to the door, that's when he collapsed. So they rush him inside, they tear off his clothes, and he says, wait a minute, it's my new blue suit. And At first, they weren't sure that it was, a bullet, but then they figured it out. Well, after the surgery, what we learned, but did not announce to the nation at that time, do y'all know that bullet was lodged 1 inch from his heart? Now, in the midst of a crisis situation, Reagan maintains a sense of humor. Nancy rushes in, totally distraught, assassination attempt, my Lord. He looks up from the gurney and says, honey, I forgot to duck. Well, some of you might remember this after all these years. That turned out to be a line he pulled out of his memory bank that Jack Dempsey, the old famous prize fighter, had uttered after a knockdown, drag-out fight. And then they're wheeling him into the operating room. The doctors are all around. They're very grave. They're wheeling him in. He looks up and says, I hope you're all Republicans. Well, they weren't, but who cares? They did a masterful job saving his life, and there were some touch-and-go moments there, as you might imagine. And for the 8 years of his presidency, Reagan maintained a handwritten correspondence with every one of those doctors that helped him that day. And I know that to be true. I met the son of one of them who said my dad saved all the letters. And he was a Democrat. Hey, it was good. Good job. Okay, now, then I heard kind of a cute story from Mike Deaver. Reagan wakes up in the recovery room. And at first, he couldn't talk. They had some tubes down his throat. So he motioned he wanted to jot something down. So they handed him a clipboard and a pencil. And he had woken up seeing white ceilings, white walls, and a beautiful nurse. They had a good-looking nurse in a white uniform standing next to him, holding his hand. And he jots down, I'm alive, aren't I? Well, and then he jotted down, if I'd had this much attention in Hollywood, I'd still be there. Oh, the man was amazing. Well, okay. Meanwhile, I'm back at the White House, okay? Now, several of the staff went to the hospital to keep track on things, and others. I happened to follow another member of the senior staff down to the Situation Room, where members of the cabinet were gathered to monitor everything and be in touch with what's going on. And at the time, well, even still, in the White House, everybody wears an ID badge, a little chain, a little ID badge, and they're color-coded that shows where you're granted access. And those, at the time, we all had temporary security clearance badges because full-field FBI clearance then took about 4 months. Okay, but they knew us, and so I was allowed to work in the sit room. So I'm in there, and I had a notebook with me. You always carry a notebook because people tell you to do stuff. So I had a notebook. I went way over in the corner, sitting way over there, not to bother anybody, but to see if I could be helpful at some point. And I'm writing down everything that happened. Well, what happened? Okay. I'll tell you some of that. First of all, who the heck is John Hinckley? Well, they're, looking all over. I mean, the FBI, the police are all over that one. Is this one lone gunman? Or could he maybe be part of a group that might target other officials at the time? We didn't know. Okay, number two, are the Allies okay? The Allies? What? Well, hey, evil empire days. Could it be an international group? We didn't know. So we're checking with the security details of all of our friends, Margaret Thatcher, Pierre Trudeau, everybody, François Mitterrand and others. Be sure, you guys okay? Yeah, all right, check it all out. Number three, what are the Soviets doing? Are they going to raise the alert level, take advantage of us at our time of crisis here? Are they scrambling any airplanes, moving any missiles around? In fact, we discovered that one of their subs was closer to our eastern shore by Georgia, in fact, than it should have been. I'm writing all this down, right? And a lot of other things, too. Well, finally, Reagan's out of surgery. All the congressional leadership have been updated hour by hour. And Bush comes back. He'd been out of town. He comes back. And things sort of quiet now. And I went home about 10 o'clock that night. Well, 2 days later, a memo comes around. And it says, anyone who has notes of the events of March 30th, please turn them in. We're doing a study to see how we can handle a crisis better in the future. So I'm thinking, well, hey, I was a reporter. I type fast, and I was there, so I'm going to write all this down. So I go to my office. I sit down at my trusty IBM Selector typewriter, and I type up 11 pages of single-space notes. Remember it well. And I go to the guy's, everything that happened. Go to the guy's office. Excuse me, sir, I have the notes. He said, already? All right, give me the notes. So he's going through them, he's looking at them, and he looks up and he says, "Did you make any copies of this?" And I said, "Well, no, sir, not yet, but, I've got the notes, I'll do that." He says, and he goes in his desk, he pulls out a stamp, and he stamps "top secret" at the top and bottom of every page. He slips them in the desk, crosses his arms, and stares at me and says, "You're not cleared to read this." Okay. True. You're such an arrogant guy. Anyway, so fast forward 30 years, right? And I file a FOIA request at the Reagan Library out there in California. You've ever been there? It's a really neat place. To get my notes back. And I get an email back from the archivist, "Hi, Karna, yes, we've located your notes. They're in file E305, but you can't have them back. They're not declassified yet." I thought, "Oh, darn." So last summer, I happened to be out there and made an appointment, went to see the archivist, gave him a book, and nice guy. He was very gracious, and he said, I'm so sorry, you're here and everything, but your notes aren't declassified yet." And he said, "But to be fair, we have 10 million documents, so they're in the queue. If I ever get them back, maybe you'll invite me back and we'll have another conversation." Okay, anyway. Then moving on from there, of course, Reagan is fine. Eventually, he's all recovered. And then we have all these meetings to say, well, where should he give his first appearance to reassure the Americans and the world that he's okay, he's back in shape. Should he maybe give a talk from the Oval Office? Should he walk hand in hand with Nancy in the Rose Garden and a nice little photo op? Well, it was decided or suggested that maybe it would be good for him to give a talk to a joint session of the Congress. It hadn't been done all that much. Well, it was a real home run. And in fact, in many of my own books, I have scenes where there's a speech to a joint session of Congress. Okay, so he goes up to the Congress, and having survived this assassination attempt, the man gets, it was incredible, about a 4-minute standing ovation. He goes up there, and it's a perfect opportunity to outline his administration, his plans, his policies, right? Okay, but as often happened, he began with a little bit of humor. He received, when he was in the hospital, literally a ton of mail. And they go through them. He kept a lot of the letters and notes, and he pulls one out of his jacket. It's from a little second-grade boy. And he reads it. It says, "Dear Mr. President, I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas." It was great. Well, anyway, this is not to be a political talk, of course, but in that speech, that's where he outlined all of his plans to restore the economy. We had 12.5% inflation and 21.5% interest rates, double-digit unemployment, tough times. And so he was, suggesting a major tax cut, dealing with the Soviets, of course, who were mucking around in the third world. Also a major cut in regulations. And when he came in, there were 80,000 pages of regs in the Federal Register. When he left, there were 40,000 pages. Incredible cut. But back up there now. And speaking, I just remembered something. Speaking of paperwork and government nonsense, Chief of Staff Jim Baker used to tell the story that sometime before that, he had a job as Assistant Secretary of Commerce. And he said one of his responsibilities was to oversee the Census Bureau and talk about paperwork and all that. He said one time the Census Bureau sent out a questionnaire to small business people and said, "Please list employees broken down by age and sex." Well, some guy in Texas wrote back, "None, but alcoholism is a big problem." You got to sort of think about that one. Well, then we had all of these policies and things in our inboxes, projects to work on, but stuff happens, as I mentioned. Events occur in any administration. You have to drop everything and deal with it. And think about some of these things and how they could be turned into mysteries and thrillers. The assassination of Sadat. The attempted assassination of the Pope. The shooting down of the Korean jetliner with an American congressman on board, by the Russians, as a matter of fact. And I happen to use that story in my second book, Gambit, which has to do with attacks on American commercial airliners. We don't know by whom. Okay, then there was the taking over the Loro cruise ship and the murder of an innocent American on board that one. You're nodding, you guys are good. And then the tragic day, oh my God, when there was the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle with a school teacher on board. I happened to be in the Oval Office when the president, actually, the Oval Office doesn't have a TV set, but right next to it there's a private study, and that's where the TV is. I was in there, the president was in there, I was in there with the NSC advisor, and when he first saw that video, it was really a tragic day. So think about all these things that happened. Then there was the PATCO strike. Remember, the air traffic controllers went out on strike early on in the administration. I used that also in that novel game. But well, what happened in that deal? The controllers said, we want a raise. Reagan looked at the numbers. He offered them an 11% raise. Well, they had all signed an agreement not to strike, as you know, but they said, look, we need a lot more money than that. I mean, it's tough up there in the tower, very stressful and all the rest of it. And some of them wanted double in their salaries. Well, they had all, as I said, agreed not to strike, but when 70% of them went out, Reagan said, I'm sorry, boys, it's not the way we do business. He fired them, and he wrote the statement himself. Now, it was interesting to see the reaction, even around the world, to a basic domestic issue, because people were looking to see how tough is this crazy cowboy from Hollywood really going to be. Well, the British were supportive, the French were not, and the Canadians, well, the Canadians closed the refueling base up at Gander in solidarity with the strikers. When Reagan heard about that, he said, open it in 2 hours or we'll never land there again. They opened it. Well, sometime later, Secretary of State George Shultz made the comment that the statement Reagan wrote, firing the air traffic controllers, was the best foreign policy statement he made to date, and I took his point. Well, the actual inspiration, I'll just mention a few of these stories, the inspiration for my very first book, Checkmate, over here, but these have all, by the way, they were written some time ago, but they've all been revised and updated and re-released a few months ago. Checkmate was inspired by Reagan's announcement of his Strategic Defense Initiative. Star Wars, missile defense, you all have heard about this, and of course it's in the news a lot today. Well, I was so intrigued, because I saw this roll out, to see everybody arguing about missile defense. What a crazy idea this was. And I saw the arguments kind of in 3 groups. The first group at the State Department, mainly, they looked at it and said, missile defense, good Lord, it's never going to work. It's a crazy scheme. Does Reagan think he's Superman, a bullet hitting a bullet? He's nuts. But, you know, come to think of it, we could trade it away in arms control talks with the Soviets. And we'll trade it away in exchange for their reduction in SS-18s and SS-20 missiles because they have more than we do. And that'd be good for us. They tried, but that didn't work. In fact, I was at the arms control talks in Geneva where we did not do that. Okay, the Pentagon looked at it, and they said, oh, man, this is going to be tough. But, you know, it's a presidential directive, so we're going to have to put out contracts to a bunch of defense contractors. It's going to cost a lot of money, but, you know, the Soviets will try to keep up with us. It'll make them spend a lot of money, too, and that'll be good for us. Bankrupt their economy. Well, Reagan took a third view, because I heard him talk about it a lot. He took what he said was a moral approach, because the policy we had at the time, and kind of still do, is called mutual assured destruction, or the MAD doctrine, as we called it, which says, in effect, that if the Soviets, or anybody, lobbed a missile our way, even by mistake, it would kill millions of innocent Americans, and all we could do in retaliation, if it had a return address, is lob one back at them and kill millions of their innocent people. Reagan said, that's not the way I want to conduct our foreign policy. And he said in his famous speech, it was just anniversary, it was on March 23rd, some years ago, his famous speech, he said, wouldn't it be better to task our best scientific minds, our best technology people, to see if they can invent a system that could stop a missile before anybody dies. And his great line was, wouldn't it be better to save lives than avenge lives? And it was really interesting to watch that whole thing roll out. And of course now, we've had several, 90-some successful tests of missile defense forces, not only in the ground interceptors, which we have out at Vandenberg Air Force Base by Santa Barbara, not on the East Coast, unfortunately. Congress should get after that. And we also have a radar tied into it up at Fort Greely, Alaska. We have the Aegis system on ships that just had a successful test in Hawaii about a week and a half ago. So, it's moving along. In any event, I created a story about a girl who works for a defense contractor, and she invents a breakthrough technology for defense against cruise missiles. There's bad guys trying to steal it, and so you weave it into a thriller. That's what you try to do. With the third book, Final Finesse, that involves a Venezuelan dictator. Well, I wrote it a long time ago. I really had to update that sucker, let me tell you. You can't have your hero rushing into the situation amidst the clatter of fax machines, right? Everything had to be updated, so that's new. But, everything isn't a disaster. Everything isn't somebody, dying in a crisis. Sometimes we just screw up. And there's humorous things that happen, and there's humor in each of the stories. There's a little love interest in each of the stories as well. I'll give you an example of screw-ups. I remember one time, it was during the re-election campaign, and we were having all these meetings to decide where the president should give his speeches, because you want to get a ton of invitations, and you want him to appeal to all the different groups. You want to speak to the women's groups, the black groups, the Hispanic groups, all the groups. You're getting votes, right? Okay. So we're in one of these meetings, and someone walks in with a copy of the Metro section of the Washington Post. And on the front is a nice story about this little boy who's about, 10, 12 years old. And he's won the science fair over there in Montgomery County. And he had invented a model airplane with a special wing, does a loop-de-loops or something. And his name is Juan Santos. And we're thinking, wow, PR opportunity. Let's invite in the kid. We'll put it on the president's schedule, get him to go in the Rose Garden. We'll dream up some sort of an award for the kid. We'll get him to fly the plane. We'll invite every single Mexican and Hispanic reporter we can find. And it's going to be a good PR deal, right? Okay, we do that. We put the whole thing together. Kid comes in. Reagan gives him an award. Kid flies the plane, take pictures. All the Mexican reporters are all there. Next day, I'm in my office, and we're putting press kits together to send all around the country to every Hispanic and Mexican radio station, newspaper we have in our database. Assistant comes in and says, I got a little problem. What's the problem? Well, I just found out Juan Santos is a Filipino. Yeah, so actually that incident is in the Reagan diaries. He wrote about it. He didn't say we screwed it up, but he talks about Juan Santos, the nice boy. So anyway, now the inspiration for the fourth book, Castle Bravo over there, came from a conversation I had with a major general. I back a little bit on the missile defense thing, sort of tied in here. Major General Trey Obering, who at the time was head of our entire missile defense worldwide, and I said, Trey, what keeps you up at night? And he said, let me tell you, something I think about a lot, and I wish Congress would think about it some more. He said, let me paint a scenario for you. Let's imagine that it's a few years down the road, and some country doesn't like us, or militant group, or whatever, God, they're out there, and they somehow get hold of a small nuclear device. Oh my God, Pakistan's got over 100 of them, we know, Iran, North Korea, whatever. He says, and they also have a delivery vehicle. They've miniaturized it enough to put it on a delivery vehicle. Could be as simple as a Scud missile. Now, there's Scuds all over the place. In fact, you can buy one from a black market arms dealer for about 100 grand today. Somebody tried to sell a Scud missile on eBay while the FBI got him. So the general said, imagine they have these components and they're in some disguised fishing boat or something off the coast. And what they're going to do is they're not going to aim it at New York, Tampa or San Francisco, which would be devastating, of course. No. What they're going to do is they're going to aim it straight up in the air, detonate it way up in the atmosphere. Scud goes 50, 100 miles up, more than that. And what that does, it doesn't kill you on the ground. Right there. That isn't what happens. What happens in that eventuality is, think of the shock waves, of course, up there. That's called an electromagnetic pulse, EMP. What that does is fry all the electronics on the ground. You would have no communications, computers, internet, cell phones, ATMs, no sanitation, refrigeration, electricity, nothing. He turned to me and said, Karna, it would set us back to the year 1910, and don't think our enemies aren't looking at it, because they are. And I happened to pull a little item out of the Wall Street Journal. This was some time ago, but I kept it. This came out right before the Singapore summit between Trump and Kim, the dude in North Korea. Remember Kim was over there shooting off missiles and stuff before that? Okay, here's the headline. North says it could cripple U.S. grid. North Korea's threats against the U.S. now include a tactic long discussed by some experts, an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, triggered by a nuclear weapon that would aim to shut down the U.S. electricity grid. So I wrote a story about that sucker, and that's called Castle Bravo. Okay, moving on to the new book that we have here tonight, which is called Trust But Verify. Recognize that title? It fits the title, though. Okay, that was inspired by sort of two different tracks. First of all, we used to have a summer home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Anybody been to Jackson Hole? I mean, some of you, it's a really pretty place. You'd recognize all the settings. Okay, every summer we watched as a certain conference took place. It's been going on out there. It still is for 30 years. It's a conference, the summer conference, hosted by the Federal Reserve Board. You think, well, that's kind of boring. I mean, what's good about that? Well, all the Fed governors are out there, all the economists from J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and everybody, plus, oh my gosh, the finance ministers from around the world are there, from Great Britain, France. I mean, it's a really big deal. Okay, put that aside. Second track, I was thinking, I've been fascinated for a long time with developments in Russia because, as I mentioned, I've been to arms control talks, summit meetings, and got to know a few of them at those meetings. And then my husband and I took business trips over there, and he watched the rise of Putin and the Russian mafia, which now is involved in 4 out of 10 Russian companies. There's so much corruption. And, of course, the oligarchs. We've all read about that. Many now have been... a lot of them are bad guys, and we put sanctions on a number of them. So I thought, bet we could create a story about this. So I created a story about 2 Russian oligarchs, 2 brothers, and they're in the illegal arms business and whatnot. But they've been sanctioned, and so they've lost a lot of money. They got to make it back, right? How are they going to replenish their coffers? So they bring over a couple of mafia types, buddies of them, and they hatch a plot to put a hit on that Fed Reserve conference in Jackson Hole. Now just imagine what would happen if there were a hit placed on that conference with all those important financial leaders from all over the world. Markets would tank, right? I mean, be a disaster. So the Russians massively short the exchanges with whatever money they have left, go out on margin and everything. And the real question is, how does my heroine, who works on the White House staff, paired with a really cool FBI special agent, ever find out about a plot like that? Could they? And if they found out, how could they stop it? That, of course, my friends, is the format of a thriller. Now, as I said, not everything is serious. You have to break it up a little humor. And there is a story that's in the book. This is true. Didn't happen to us. It happened in the Ford days. Now, what happened was President and Mrs. Ford invited Queen Elizabeth over for a state visit. So she comes over, and they have a lovely dinner in the state dining room, and then afterwards you go down the cross hall. You pass the red room, the blue room, the green room, and you go into the East Room at the other end, which is lovely with chandeliers and gleaming floors, and it's really pretty, gold drapery and everything. And that's where you have music, entertainment, and dancing. So at the right time, the president asked the Queen if she would grace him with her presence on the dance floor. She nods, so he helps her up, walking over, and just as she's about to step on the dance floor, the Marine band behind them strikes up the song, "The Lady is a Tramp." Yeah, true story. You can look it up, it's a true story. You know, there was another story about Queen. This is kind of delicate. I don't know if I should tell this. Oh, we're all friends. What the hell? I'm going to tell a story. I wouldn't put this in a book. It's a little bit delicate, but it happened in the Reagan days. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. What happened was President Reagan is invited by the Queen to go over to Great Britain for a visit. And so they were making all kinds of plans and suggestions about photo ops and recreation and things like that. So evidently our people said, hey, here's an idea. Why don't we suggest that they arrange a horseback ride together? Because Reagan looks great, you know, I mean, he's on a horse all the time, it's terrific. And the Queen loves horses, you know, she's got her favorite horse and everything. So I bet that would work, and it would really be, you know, good pictures for us. So they do all that. They plan it and everything. The Brits think it's a great idea. So now they're out there, and Reagan's in his riding outfit on this big, wonderful-looking horse the Brits have for him. And the Queen is on her favorite horse in her nice riding habit. And the press is all lined up on either side. They're filming and all this. And so, you know, they start down, and they're kind of beginning to trot along. And all of a sudden, the Queen's horse has a bit of a digestive problem. It's getting sort of noisy and everything. And the Queen's looking rather embarrassed, and she finally looks over and says, oh, Mr. President, I'm so sorry. She looks over, oh, that's okay, I thought it was the horse. Oh, man. Yeah. That's Reagan, you know, I mean, but to be honest, the Queen has a good sense of humor, so it turned out okay. Now, you know, I love talking about President Reagan, and so what I like to do when I sort of at the end of a talk is give you a little quote. And this is sort of similar to, I think, how Mike was feeling when he became an American citizen. This is a great quote. This is what Reagan said to a group when he spoke much like this. He said, "You can play a special part in the future. You'll be its author. Take full advantage of the wonderful life that lies in store for you. Rejoice in your freedom. Sample the full richness of opportunities that lie before you. Help one another. Trust in yourselves. Have faith in God, and you'll find more joy and happiness than you could imagine. And always remember that you are Americans, and it is your birthright to dream great dreams in this sweet and blessed land, truly the greatest, freest, strongest nation on earth." And now I want to end with a very short little video that you might. If there are one or two questions, it'd be great. Trying to keep it off politics, and if there's anything about publishing or Reagan or anything like that. Yes, ma'am.
Are your books available for Kindle?
Yeah. All the books are available on Kindle, and I've got a card up here. The easiest thing, go to my website, because they're all summarized there. There's right under the cover art is like linked to by Amazon, by Kindle, and that's good because, as I said, they've all been re-released, and you don't want one of the old ones, the old cover. You want the new covers. So they are. That's nice, and I only have the new ones with me, which I'm happy to sign if you want one. Any other question? Yes, sir.
For the non-reader type, when can we go to the cinema? Or can you talk about the pathway? It's a plant. She asked me to ask this question.
He asked me about movies, and so, oh, by the way, this one, Trust But Verify, at the end of April, is coming out in audio as well. It'll be on Amazon available. audiobook. Movie, though, he did ask that. I said, well, ask me in the Q&A. Here's the deal. Everyone says, well, why didn't you get a movie deal? Because they sound like they could be good stories, you know, maybe on Netflix or, you know, whatever. Well, here's the problem with that. Yes, every author thinks it'd really be terrific to get a movie deal. I mean, look how authors get their start. John Grisham, for example, wrote his first book, and he has said that he got $5,000 for it. It didn't sell well at all. But undaunted, he wrote the second book, and his agent was able to sell it to Paramount for $600,000. The firm was made into a movie, and from that moment on, he became a best-selling author because he was well-known. It was terrific. Other authors, you have to wait to be a bestseller, and then the producers will pay attention to you. For example, Lee Child, who's a good friend and has given a couple of blurbs for my books, we're all members of something called International Thriller Writers. And Lee wrote several books, finally became a best-selling author, and his agent said, you know, I'd really like to try to get a movie deal for you, Lee. And she said, fine. If anybody's read Lee Child's books, his hero, Jack Reacher, is a 6'5", big, you know, burly army detective kind of a guy. And Lee says, go for it, sell it to anybody but Tom Cruise. 7 Tom Cruise. So guess who buys the franchise? Tom Cruise. So we're giving Lee a really bad time. In fact, somebody put a website together, TomCruise'sNoJackReacher.com. And, but Lee just sort of smiled and said, yeah, I know, but, you know, Mr. Cruise is a very good actor, director, and producer, and Lee just grins and accepts the check. So, but the thing is, I have heard at our meetings, we have an annual conference of international thriller writers at the Grand Hyatt in New York every July. We get 1,000 people there, you know, a lot of aspiring writers. We do workshops and stuff. And I have heard the number is of all the authors who do get an option, you get a few grand to get an option to see if they can put a movie together, 97% of those optioned are never made into movies because they don't get the money, they don't get the producer, they don't get the star. So it's a very, very tough sell. I mean, look at all the books that are out there. I mean, there's 6 million books on Amazon and not that many movies, at least not that many good ones that I've seen. So it was a tough sell, but yeah, it would be nice. Maybe someday, who knows. Is there another question that we have in the audience? Anybody? Yeah, sir.
It was referenced in the film about Gorbachev and the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
Is there any backstory you could share with us? Because, you know, Reagan kind of challenged Gorbachev about the wall, and you know, what was going on at that time that you could recollect?
Well, he certainly did. And in fact, when he was ready to go over there and speak there, you know, in front of that wall, what happened was that the speech was put together, speech writers, and they talked to Reagan and everything, and then a speech goes around to be cleared by the Pentagon and the State Department of various places. And it went around, and Reagan had put in the line, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Every time, it went around several times, and each time, either State Department or a colleague at the National Security Council or somebody at the Pentagon took that out. And the story I heard was Reagan was in the staff car with Mike Deaver, and on the way to the event, and he looked over and said, Mike, I don't give a damn. I'm going to say what I want to say. And he overruled everybody. And he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And that's the one line everybody remembered. You know, I remember that story. It was incredible. Yeah. Of course, later, you know, he and Gorbachev did have several meetings, you know, as you know, and some were, you know, fruitful, and some, you know, they bit of a standoff, say, in Reykjavik. Finally, oh, by the way, they finally had a summit meeting in Moscow. This was after I left the White House, but I just finished recently reading a book. There's a terrific book that Brett Baer of Fox News wrote. It's called 3 Days in Moscow. And it's all about Reagan's background and then leading up to the 3 days of talks in Moscow of Reagan and Gorbachev. Wonderful book. And there was a very interesting little side story in that book that I think you would enjoy, and I think Mike would enjoy hearing this too. Evidently, in Moscow at that time, there were some confrontations and there was demonstrations in the streets and the secret police were being roughhousing and some difficult things. And anyway, so when meeting was over and the president, first lady, White House staff, and the press pool and everybody got back on Air Force One and had taken off to come back home, everybody, president, White House staff, and the press corps stood up and sang, "God Bless America." I like that story. I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, one more question. I know you all want to go to dinner. Yes, sir.
I've read that the relationship between President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher was not as friendly as it appeared to be in the press. Is that true or not true?
Well, they had their ups and downs, sure, but I think basically they had some disagreements on a couple of things. That you're right. But I think the press has overblown that because basically they really were on the same track from their philosophical, their points of view. And I remember after, oh my gosh, let me think. It was after Reagan was out of office. It was the next campaign, and there was a dinner. Reagan wasn't there. Was a dinner in Washington. I've always had a dinner on February 6th to celebrate Reagan's birthday, and they bring in a big speaker, and you get a lot of the alumni are there and everything. And we brought in Maggie Thatcher, and she's the one that made a huge tribute to him. And of course, she had taped a tribute, an audio tribute to him that was given at his funeral. So no, she had very strong feelings for him. Even just like family members can disagree on a few things. Basically, I think they were on the same track. Hey, you guys have been great. If you want a book, I'm right over here. Thanks. Thank you.